Get this black stray out of my sight before she stains my family's name any further!
Vivienne Hartwell's voice cut through the silent, diamond-studded ballroom like a blade of ice. Imani stood perfectly still in her simple ivory wedding gown. She looked directly into the matriarch's eyes. And when she spoke, her voice was calm and steady.
Julian invited me, Mrs. Hartwell. I am his wife.
Wife?
Camille, Julian's sister, stepped forward. Her face twisted with disgust, and with one brutal flick of her wrist, she threw a full glass of deep red wine straight at Imani's chest. It struck the white silk with a wet slap, and bloomed across it like a wound, soaking the gown until it clung to her, dark and dripping. Before Imani could even draw a breath, Vivienne stepped in, raised her hand, and brought it across Imani's face. The crack of the slap echoed off the marble floor.
Look at you. A ghetto girl with dark skin trying to play dress-up in diamonds. You smell like poverty, and you reek of my son's money.
Clean the floor with your knees on your way out. The service entrance is through the kitchen. Leave like the help you are.
250 of the wealthiest people on the coast watched it happen, smirking behind their champagne. Not one of them stepped in. Not one of them said a single word. But Vivienne Hartwell had no idea what she had just done. The quiet woman she had just struck across the face was the only daughter of the most powerful tycoon on the eastern seaboard. And this century-old empire, 4 generations of the Hartwell name, was about to be ground into dust on the marble floor of its own ballroom. Welcome to the silent verdict, where the arrogant play their dirty little games, and the quiet ones always turn out to be holding the entire deck. If you want to watch pure justice served stone cold, take 1 second right now and subscribe. Because you are about to see exactly how this billionaire matriarch lost everything she owned in a single night. Now let me take you back 2 hours, to when the evening still looked like the proudest night of Vivienne Hartwell's life. And nobody in that house could have imagined how it would end. The Hartwell estate, a place called Ravenscourt, sat on a shelf of gray granite above the Rhode Island shoreline. Gray stone and tall black windows. The kind of house that gets its own line in the guidebooks. The Hartwell family had owned it for 100 years. And tonight, every window was lit gold. Candle be candle. And the long lawns rolled away into a darkness you could hear but not see, where the sea moved against the rocks below. Inside, the great ballroom had been turned into something out of a magazine. White roses by the thousand, a floor polished until it threw the chandeliers back at the ceiling, a 12-piece orchestra tuning low in the corner, and 250 guests moving through it all in silk and diamonds, holding champagne they barely touched. Senators, shipping magnates, a federal judge, 3 newspaper columnists, a former ambassador, enough old money in one room to buy a small country. They had come to watch the Hartwell heir get married. And more than that, they had come to be seen watching. The bride arrived through all of it without making a sound. Her name was Imani. And a few hours earlier, she had become Imani Hartwell. Though almost nobody in that room would have believed it to look at her, she wore a simple ivory gown. No train. No crystals. Nothing that flashed. Her shoes were flat. The only piece of jewelry on her body was a thin band of worn silver on her right hand, scratched soft by decades of use. The kind of ring a careful eye might mistake for nothing at all. She had chosen every bit of it on purpose. She had spent her whole life learning that the loudest thing in a room is rarely the most important thing in it. And she had no intention of being loud tonight, to the guests. She looked like someone who had wandered in from a smaller, poorer life. A girl who had gotten lucky. A girl who did not belong. but she did not move like a stranger. At the edge of the ballroom, a young waiter named Devon caught the lip of his tray on the back of a chair. 12 flutes of champagne tilted toward the floor, and the whole future of his evening tilted with them. Imani was already there. She steadied the tray with 2 fingers and a flat palm beneath his wrist. Easy, like she had been waiting for it. Breathe, she said quietly. You've got it. Nobody saw a thing. Devon let out a shaking breath, as if she had pulled him back from the edge of a roof. Thank you, Mom. Imani, she said, and smiled. And you're Devon. Your name tag is crooked. He fixed it. Stunned that she had even read it, she knew the cloakroom attendant's name too. Rosa. And she asked, low, whether Rosa's mother had come through her surgery all right. Rosa's eyes went wide, that this woman remembered, and then they went soft. She's home. She's doing good. You remembered. Of course, I remembered. Imani pressed a folded bill into her hand that was far more than the cloakroom ever saw in a single night. She did the same for Hector at the valet stand, who had already parked 100 German cars and would park 100 more, and who had not expected anyone inside that house to look at him twice. None of them knew who she was. She liked it exactly that way. That was the entire point. Imani and Julian Hartwell had been together for 2 years. In those 2 years, she had never once told his family the truth about her own. She wanted to be married for the woman she was, not for the name standing behind her. And she had learned a long time ago that the surest way to find out who a person really is to let them believe you are powerless. So she drove a 5-year-old car. She wore plain clothes. She let the Hartwells assume she came from nothing. And she watched, patiently, to see what they would do with the assumption. What they did with it was try, for 2 years, to make her disappear. Vivienne had opposed the relationship from the very first dinner, when she had looked Imani over across the long table and asked, right in front of the soup course, what her people did for a living. And then she had visibly lost interest the moment the answer was a grandmother who cleaned houses and a mother in, as Imani put it, logistics. After that, the campaign was quiet and constant. There was the parade of more suitable young women seated beside Julian at every family event. There was the trust fund. Vivienne dangled and then withdrew. There was the afternoon she had cornered Imani alone in the conservatory and slid a blank check across a glass table, a large one, and offered to fill in any number the girl wanted in exchange for walking away cleanly and sparing everyone the embarrassment. Imani had looked at the check, and then at the woman, and had slid it gently back across the glass without a single word. And that silence had frightened Vivienne more than any argument ever could have. Because people who cannot be bought are the only people the very rich do not know how to fight. Through all of it, Imani never raised her voice. She never told Julian the worst of what his mother said behind closed doors. And she never once played the single card that would have ended the entire war in an afternoon. She kept it tucked in her sleeve. She was waiting for a night exactly like this one. Julian found her across the floor and folded her hand into his comment. He had his mother's height and none of her chill. He had grown up inside this house, under this woman, learning to make himself small to keep the peace. And he had spent the last 2 years slowly, painfully learning how to stand up straight. You okay? He asked. He always asked. It's a beautiful party, she said. My mother is in rare form tonight. He said it lightly, but his jaw was tight. Just stay close to me. I always do. All around them. The talk was money, the way it always is in rooms like that. A man bragged about a boat. A woman complained about her decorator, the way other people complain about a war. But underneath the orchestra, in tight little knots near the bar, the talk was something else. Something nervous. Imani caught pieces of it as she passed. The way you catch smoke. Hartwell Maritime is one bad quarter from the wall. Everything is riding on the renewal. If Bishop does not sign, we are finished. 100 years. Gone. They said the name like a prayer they were not sure would be answered. Bishop. The partner whose contract would either keep the family empire breathing or let it die quietly in its sleep. $1.8 billion of terminal and freight business. Up for renewal. And the chairman who controlled it had never once been seen in public. No photograph anyone could find. No face. The company's entire survival rested on a signature from a person none of them had ever met. Imani heard all of it. She drank her water and said nothing and let the room glitter. She checked her phone once, read a single line of a message, and let it slip back into her small clutch. Whatever it said. Her shoulders came down half an inch. Like a held breath finally set free. She knew something the whole house did not. She had known it all along, and near the great stone fireplace, beneath a 100-year-old oil portrait of a man in a sea captain's coat with the Hartwell jaw, the matriarch of the house held court. She had already decided that tonight was the night the stray would be put out for good. Vivienne Hartwell was 63 years old and built like a closed door. She was tall and straight-backed, her silver hair lacquered into a crown, draped in midnight blue silk and a long rope of sapphires that caught the candlelight like a row of cold blue eyes. She had buried her husband 8 years before and had never, in any way that mattered, stopped wearing his power. Charles Hartwell had inherited a shipping line and grown it into an empire. When he died, the men in suits all assumed his widow would sell. Instead, she took the chair at the head of the table and held it with a grip that frightened them. And she ran Hartwell Maritime Group, the way she ran everything by the rules of a world that no longer existed, where blood was destiny, and certain people belonged, and certain other people, no matter what they did or what they built, never would. She shook hands like she was handing out blessings. When a senator kissed her cheek, she allowed it. When the federal judge laughed too loudly, she let her gaze rest on him until he stopped. And when her eyes found Imani across the floor, they went flat as slate. It was a particular kind of look, and Imani had been on the other side of it her entire life. The look you give a smudge on clean glass? The look that decides who a person is before that person has said one word. And it had decided. In this case, the moment it registered the color of her skin and the plainness of her dress, and did the cruel, lazy arithmetic that some people do without even knowing they are doing it. Help. Hired. Lesser. A mistake that had somehow gotten into the family and would have to be removed before it spread. Imani felt the look land between her shoulder blades. She lifted her chin 1/4 of an inch and let it slide off her like water off oilcloth. She had a great deal of practice. Camille came gliding over before her mother did. Julian's oldest sister, 38. Married into the Crane fortune, and twice as invested in the family pedigree as anyone actually born into it. She wore emeralds and a smile with no warmth in it at all. What a bold little dress. Camille murmure, looking Imani up and down like a tax assessor. So brave of you. Most girls would have at least tried, and she drifted away before Imani could answer, leaving the words hanging in the air like cheap perfume. A few guests nearby hid their smiles behind their glasses. Julian's hand tightened on Imani's. Don't, she said softly. Not tonight. Tonight matters more than they know. She glanced at the tall black windows. Beyond them, the long drive curved away into the dark. Empty. Waiting. She did not look worried. She looked like a woman who had set a very long fuse a very long time ago. and could feel it finally getting close to the end. There was supposed to be a toast. The bandleader had just lifted his baton for the bridal waltz when Vivienne stepped onto the low riser beside the orchestra and raised a single hand. A waiter, trained to her smallest gesture, put a microphone into it. The music stopped. 250 faces turned. Smiling, expecting a mother's blessing. "Thank you all for being here," Vivienne said, and her voice carried beautifully, warm as a hostess, cold as the sea outside. 100 years ago, my husband's grandfather built this family on 3 things: discipline, honesty, and knowing exactly who you are and exactly where you come from. She let it sit. "So I think the kindest thing I can do tonight, for everyone, is to make absolutely sure we all know who has just joined us." The smiles in the room began, very slightly, to change. "Come up here, dear," she said, and looked straight at Imani. Imani did not move. "I'm happy where I am. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sure you are." Vivienne's smile thinned. 2 years, my son has known you. 2 years, and in all that time, not one of us has met a single member of your family. Not one of them here tonight. On the most important evening of your life. No mother, no father, no aunts, no cousin, no people. An empty chair on the bride's side. At a Hartwell wedding. She turned to the crowd, opening her hands like a woman sharing a perfectly reasonable concern. "So I ask you all, what kind of woman comes to a marriage with no one behind her, with no name, no history, nothing she will let anybody look at?" "My family could not be here," Imani said evenly. "How convenient." Julian crossed the floor fast. "Mother, stop this. Right now. Sit down. Julian, I am protecting you, whether you can see it or not." She did not even glance at him. She turned back to Imani, and her voice dropped into something quieter and far uglier. "I had you looked into." Imani's eyes lifted. "You did what?" "You heard me. I hired a man. Quiet. Expensive. Thorough. I wanted to know precisely what had attached itself to my son." She spread her hands wide, performing for the room. "And do you know what he found? Nothing. No estate. No trust. No family worth $1. A girl from a rented apartment, whose grandmother scrubbed other people's floors, who looked at my son and saw a way up." She tilted her head. "People like you always see the way up." There it was. People like you. She said it the way certain people say the worst word there is. Smooth. Polished. Deniable. Daring anybody in the room to be rude enough to name it. The guests had gone very quiet. Somewhere a glass touched a tray. A woman near the bar covered a small laugh. And the room, in that moment, quietly split itself in two, the way rooms always do. Most of them had the decency, at least, to look uncomfortable. A few studied the floor, or their drinks, or the middle distance. Anywhere but at the young woman being skinned alive in the center of the room. But a handful leaned in. You could see it on them. The same hunger you see at the rail of a racetrack, or the edge of a schoolyard fight. The particular thrill, the comfortable get from watching someone they believe is beneath them be put in her place, as long as their own hands stay clean and their own names stay out of it. Not one of them moved. Not one of them said, the simple thing, "That's enough." Vivienne. That any one of them could have said, and that all of them would later swear, to anyone who asked, they had been just about to. 250 powerful people, And the only person in that ballroom willing to stand between the bride and the matriarch was the matriarch's own son. I mean exactly what I say. Vivienne went on, ignoring him. She is beneath us, and she always will be. Imani stood perfectly still. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, and it carried farther than the microphone ever could. Your investigator was not very good. Mrs. Hartwell. Vivienne laughed. A single dry note. My investigator is the finest money can buy. And money, dear, is the one language your kind never learns to speak. You only ever learn how to reach for it. Don't talk to her like that. Julian's voice was shaking now. Don't you dare. I will talk to her any way I please. This is my house. My name. My family. She stepped closer to Imani. And her perfume was expensive, and her contempt was total. And you will never, ever, truly be one of us. A piece of paper from a courthouse does not make you a Hartwell. It just makes you a problem I will have to solve. And then, the way these things always happen, the knight handed her a weapon. Carelessly, a photographer had been staging a portrait by the fireplace. The bride and groom and the matriarch, beneath the 100-year-old painting of the founder. For the family record, and for the camera, Vivienne had lifted both hands to her throat a few minutes earlier and unclasped the great sapphire necklace she had been wearing. The Hartwell sapphire, a famous stone the size of a robin's egg, ringed in old diamonds. Worn by 4 generations of Hartwell brides, she had wanted it in the shot beside her, draped over the founder's gilded frame like a relic. Not around her own neck. She had laid it on the marble mantel. On a square of black velvet a footman held out, and turned to fix her wrap. The photographer took his frames and ancients. The footman was called away, and nobody thought about it again, until now, because Vivienne, reaching up to put it back on, found the velvet on the mantel empty. For one beat she simply stared at it. Then her head came up, and her eyes went straight across the room, past her own son, past 40 guests, past the fireplace and the empty velvet and her own 2 hands. And they landed on Imani. Where is it? She said. The room turned. Where is my necklace? Her voice climbed. The Hartwell sapphire. It was right here. On this mantel. 2 minutes ago. She was already crossing the floor. Silk hissing. And the guests parted in front of her like water. You were standing closest to it. You were the only one near it. I have not moved from this spot. Mrs. Hartwell, Imani said. Liar. The word cracked across the ballroom. Of course you would say that. Of course you would. She spun toward the wall. Mr. Doyle. Now, Frank Doyle, the head of estate security, came forward slowly, and his discomfort was written across his whole body. He had the build of a former state trooper and the unhappy face of a man who could already see exactly where this was going. Mrs. Hartwell, I cannot search a guest without. She is not a guest. She is a thief. And this is my house. And my property. And you are paid by me. Search her. Hiape. Now. Mum. I would need her consent. I do not care what you would need. Vivienne wheeled on him. And there was a wildness in her now. The panic of a woman who would rather burn the whole night to the ground than be wrong in front of the people she had spent her life ruling. Open. The bag. The whole room had gone silent. The candles threw long shadows across the marble, and every one of those shadows seemed to point at the young woman in the simple ivory dress. Imani looked at Frank Doyle. He looked back, ashamed. and his hand was already half lifting. Because he had a mortgage and a pension and a boss with a long memory. You don't have to do this. Imani told him quietly. He does not have a choice. Vivienne snapped. The clutch. Open it. And something flickered behind Imani's eyes then. Not fear. A deep, old, tired anger. Because she had stood in this exact moment before. Not this room, but this moment. Hands reaching for her things. Strangers deciding she was guilty before a single question was asked. The particular, full-body shame of being searched in public like a criminal. For the crime of existing in a place where someone had decided she did not belong. She was 9 years old again. In a department store across town from the apartment, holding her grandmother's hand. Her grandmother had saved for 3 weeks to buy Imani one good winter coat. And a man in a brown blazer had followed them from the moment they walked in, past the gloves, past the scarves, down every aisle, never more than 10 feet behind. Watching their hands, and at the register he had stepped in close and asked, loudly enough for the whole line to hear, to see inside her grandmother's purse. Imani remembered the heat that had climbed her own face. She remembered wanting to scream at him, at all of them, at the whole watching store, and she remembered her grandmother, Odessa Bishop, who had scrubbed other people's floors for 40 years and raised 2 children on what she earned doing it. Simply setting the purse on the counter and opening it. No tears, no shouting, just her chin lifted half an inch and her hands perfectly steady, while a stranger pawed through a lifetime of small dignities, a coin purse, a folded church bulletin, a photograph of a daughter who would one day own more than that man could dream of. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. And Odessa had paid for the coat in crumpled bills and walked her granddaughter out into the cold with her back straight as a flagpole. In the car, Imani had finally cried. And her grandmother had let her. And then she had said the thing Imani would carry for the rest of her life. Babe. They get to decide what they think they see. They do not get to decide who you are. That part is yours. You keep it, no matter what their hands are doing. You keep it, the worn silver ring. She had slipped off her finger and dropped into her clutch on the drive over tonight. Soft and gray and scratched thin by 40 years of work. Was the only thing of Odessa's she had asked to keep when the old woman passed. It was the most valuable object in that entire ballroom. And not one person there could have told you why. Imani held out the clutch. Doyle took it gently, almost apologetically, and opened it in front of 250 people. He turned it over above his own open palm. Out fell a phone, a folded tissue, a tube of lip balm, a single brass house key on a plain ring, and nothing else. He shook it. He ran his thumb along the lining. He held it upside down by its corners and shook it again. Hard, no sapphire, no diamonds, a stick of gum. The silence in the room changed shape. A few guests glanced at one another. Check again, Vivienne demanded. Her voice had lost something. She has hidden it. Check the lining. Check hair. There is nothing here. Mrs. Hartwell. Doyle's voice was careful. It is empty. There is nothing in this bag but her. He stopped, holding up the only object of any value that had been inside it. The worn silver band lay in his palm now. Scratched. Thin. The silver gone soft and gray with age. A $20 ring. If that. Just this. That is not mine, Vivienne said, as if the ring itself offended her. Of course, that is not what I. She has hidden the sapphire on her body. Search her coat. Search her. That, Julian said. in a voice none of them had heard from him before. Is enough. He lunged for his mother, and a second guard caught him by the shoulders and held him. He strained, his jaw locked, his eyes wild. Get your hands off her things. She did not take anything. You lost it. You lost your own necklace. And now you are trying to ruin her with it. In front of every person you know. Hold him, Vivienne said coldly. The guard's hands clamped down. Julian fought them and could not break free. And across the floor, Imani caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet, it said. Wait. She stood very still in the center of it all. 250 people. 100 phones lifted now and glowing. Openly recording. No one even pretending to stop them anymore. A guard gripping her new husband. A man holding her empty bag and her grandmother's $20 ring. And the most powerful woman in the room staring at her with open hatred. Waiting. Almost hungry. For her to finally break and cry. She did not. Mrs. Hartwell, Imani said. And her voice rang out clean and level across the whole silent ballroom. Your necklace is on the mantel, behind the founder's portrait, in the shadow of the frame, where you set it down for the photograph and forgot it when you fixed your wrap. I watched you do it 4 minutes ago. It slid off the velvet when the footman was called away. Every head in the room turned toward the fireplace, and there it was. A footman stepped up, reached into the shadow at the back of the mantel, where the great gilded frame met the cold stone, and lifted out a circle of blue fire, the Hartwell sapphire. It caught the candlelight and threw it across the ceiling in 100 broken pieces of blue and white, and he held it up for 250 people to see. It had never left the mantel. Allons. Terrible quiet. A few guests looked at the floor, ashamed to have stood there and watched. An older woman near the bar quietly reached for her wrap. Whatever this wedding had been an hour ago, it had curdled into something none of them wanted to be filmed standing near. Imani had been accused, searched, and paraded in front of the most important people on the coast. And she had been right. She had been right the entire time. But Vivienne Hartwell did not apologize. Women like her never do. Not when they are losing. And this is the part where she crossed a line that no amount of money would ever be able to buy back. Because being wrong, in front of all those people, was the one thing in the world Vivienne Hartwell could not survive. So she did what cornered. Cruel. Powerful people do. She stopped trying to win the argument. And she simply decided to hurt the person standing in front of her instead. It does not matter, she said, and her voice had gone low and shaking with rage. Sapphire or no sapphire, you do not belong in this house, and you never will. She drew herself up to her full height, and when she spoke again, it was loud enough to reach the very back of the room. Get this black stray out of my sight before she stains my family's name any further. Imani stood perfectly still in her simple ivory gown. She looked directly into the matriarch's eyes, and her voice did not waver. Julian invited me. Mrs. Hartwell. I am his wife. His wife Camille stepped forward, her face twisted with disgust. A full glass of red wine in her hand. You are a stain, and stains get cleaned up. And with one brutal flick of her wrist, she threw the wine straight at Imani's chest. It struck the white silk with a wet, ugly slap and bloomed across it like a wound. Dark red soaking into the pristine gown until it clung to her skin. Dripping onto the polished marble at her feet, the room gasped. And in that half-second of shock, before Imani could even draw a breath, Vivienne stepped in, raised her hand, and brought it across Imani's face. The crack of the slap echoed off the marble floor and the high stone walls and for one full second, nobody in that ballroom of 250 people made a sound. Look at you. Vivienne sneered, and she seized Imani's chin in her jeweled fingers and wrenched her head up, forcing her to stare down at the ruined dress. A ghetto girl with dark skin, playing dress-up in my family's diamonds. You smell like poverty, and you reek of my son's money. That is all you have ever been, and all you will ever be. Clean the floor with your knees on the way out. Jamile, he said, laughing openly now. Delighted. The service entrance is through the kitchen, where you should have come in. Leave the way the help leaves. Imani's cheek was scarlet, where the hand had landed. Wine ran off the hem of her gown and pooled red on the white marble. Her new husband was being held back by a guard, straining and shouting. Helpless. And 250 of the most important people on the eastern seaboard stood and watched a woman be struck across the face at her own wedding, and smirked behind their champagne. And not one single one of them stepped forward. But Imani did not cry. She did not crumble. She slowly reached up and took Vivienne's wrist and lifted the older woman's hand away from her chin, firmly, and set it back down at Vivienne's side. And when she spoke, her voice was steady and almost kind, and it carried to every corner of that frozen room. No, Mrs. Hartwell, a pause. You picked the wrong woman to humiliate, and in about 90 seconds, you are going to understand exactly what that means. Something in her tone made Vivienne stop, just for a single heartbeat. A flicker of doubt crossed the older woman's face. There and gone, like a draft moving a candle flame. Then she laughed it off. Is that a threat? She shook her head, almost pitying. You do not have the power to threaten anyone in this room. You never will. I don't need power, Imani said quietly. I just need to wait. And my mother does not like being kept waiting. Outside, beyond the tall black windows, a car door shut. Firm, unhurried. The sound carried clean across the silent ballroom. Footsteps followed it, slow and even, crunching across the gravel toward the front steps of the house. Vivienne did not hear them. She was still standing over Imani, still drunk on her own cruelty, still certain, but Frank Doyle heard. His earpiece had crackled to life, and whatever the man at the gate had just said into it made his eyebrows climb toward his hairline. He pressed 2 fingers to his ear. Say that again? He murmured. He listened. His face changed. Say her name again. Slowly, he listened a second time. The color began to drain out of him. Mrs. Hartwell, he said. She ignored him. Mrs. Hartwell. Louder. What? She spun. What could possibly be more important than, there is a car at the front steps. Doyle swallowed hard. A woman just came in. No appointment. She says she is here for the bride. He paused. Mom, I really think you are going to want to see this one yourself. The tall front doors of Ravenscourt swung open, and the cold sea air rolled in across the marble and guttered the nearest candles. And the orchestra fell silent in the middle of a bar. And 250 people turned toward the entrance as a woman stepped through the doorway. She was perhaps 60 years old. Black, like Imani, with the same calm carriage and the same steady eyes. She was dressed in a plain dark wool coat, well made, but unremarkable. The kind of coat you could buy in any city in the country. No yavels, no furs, no entourage at her back, no assistant, no bodyguard, no driver hovering at her elbow. She had simply walked in alone. The way a person walks when she has not been told to wait for anything, in a very, Very long time. Her eyes moved over the room slowly. The lifted phones, the guard with his hands still on the groom's shoulders, the footman by the fireplace holding up a sapphire, the red wine pooled on the white marble, and then her daughter, standing alone in the center of all of it, in a soaked and ruined wedding gown, with a bright red handprint rising across one cheek and the older woman's face, until that moment so composed, went very, very cold. She did not look angry. Exactly. Anger would have been warmer than this. She looked like a woman reading the last page of a book she had already guessed the ending of, and finding she had been right, and taking no joy in it at all. Her eyes moved from the wine, to the handprint, to her daughter's eyes, and then up, slowly, to the silver-haired woman standing over her. And they fixed there, and stayed. She crossed half the floor in silence, and stopped beside Imani, and reached up and very gently touched the scarlet mark on her daughter's cheek with the backs of 2 fingers. And Imani, who had not cried through the search, who had not cried through the wine, who had not cried through the slap, let out one long, shaking breath at the feeling of her mother's hand. "I'm okay. Mom," she said softly. "I know you are. Baby." The woman's voice was quiet and even, and somehow it filled the entire ballroom without rising at all. "I know exactly who you are." She turned and looked out at the room. "It is everyone else here who is about to find out." Vivienne Hartwell looked at the stranger and saw exactly what she always saw. A plain coat, dark skin, a woman with no jewels and no escort who had walked uninvited into her ballroom. And her mind filled in the rest before her eyes could correct it. "And who?" Vivienne said, her lip curling, recovering her cruelty. "Is this supposed to be? Did you call your handler?" "Girl, I am afraid your people are not welcome here either. The pair of you can leave together. Camille, show this one, where the service door is." She clearly cannot find the front of a house on her own. Camille took one step forward, smiling, and opened her mouth. And that was when Raymond Voss made a sound like a man being punched in the stomach. Raymond Voss was the chief financial officer of Hartwell Maritime Group, and he had been hovering near the bar all night, with a glass he had not touched and a phone he kept checking, half watching the chaos, dreading Monday. And now he was staring at the woman in the plain coat, and the blood was leaving his face like water out of a cracked glass. He took a step forward, stopped, took off his glasses, polished them on his lapel with shaking hands, and put them back on, as if he did not trust his own eyes. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Raymond." Vivienne's voice was sharp. "What is the matter with you?" He did not answer her. He took another step toward the woman in the coat, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked clean down the middle on the word, "Ms. Bishop." The room did not yet understand, but Vivienne's executives, scattered through the crowd, understood one by one, like a string of lights going out down a long hallway. "Chairman Bishop," Voss said, and now there was something very close to terror in it. "Ma'am, we had no idea. Nobody told us you were if we had known you were coming tonight. We would have. You were not meant to know," the woman said. Her voice was even and unhurried, and it filled the entire ballroom without lifting once. "I wanted to see this family the way they actually are, when they believe no one important is watching." Vivienne's certainty flickered for the first time all night. "Bishop." She looked from her ashen finance chief to the woman in the plain coat. "Who in God's name is Bishop Raymond?" "What are you talking about?" Raymond Voss turned to his employer. and he had the face of a man watching a building come down on top of his own life. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "that is Della Bishop, the founder and chairman of Bishop Global." He swallowed. The renewal. The $1.8 billion contract. The one keeping this entire company alive. The one we have all spent 8 months praying she would sign. His voice dropped to almost nothing. She owns it. She owns us. There is no Hartwell Maritime in 90 days without her name on that page. The words hit the ballroom like a dropped tray of crystal. A murmur swept through the crowd. Fast and electric. Phones turned. The senator who had laughed too loudly an hour ago became suddenly deeply interested in his shoes. The federal judge set down his glass. Vivian's face had gone slack. That is no. That is not possible. She came in a department. She came in a department store coat. She has no people with her. She does not need any. Voss said. Della Bishop turned her full attention onto Vivian Hartwell then. And the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You are right." Della said. "I came quietly. I came in an old coat. I did not announce myself. And I did not bring a single soul with me. Do you know why?" She let the silence stretch. "Because I wanted to know exactly what kind of family my only daughter had married into." The word landed in the hush like a stone dropped down a deep well. Daughter. Every head in the room turned to Imani. She stood beside Della now, calm and steady, her ruined gown still dripping, that red handprint still bright on her cheek, her mother's hand resting lightly on her shoulder, and she looked her mother-in-law dead in the eye. "Hi, Mom," she said softly. "What took you so long?" Vivian's mouth opened. No sound came out. "You spent this entire evening." Della went on, her voice quiet and clear, and absolutely without mercy, explaining to my daughter that she was nothing. You called her a stray. You said she smelled of poverty. You told 250 people that her grandmother scrubbed floors, as if that were a stain on her. Instead of a crown, you had your man search her like a criminal over a necklace that was sitting on your own mantle, where your own hands had left it. Her voice did not rise, but something behind it had gone to iron. And then, when none of that was enough for you, when being wrong in front of your friends was more than your pride could bear, you threw wine on my child at her own wedding, and you struck her across the face, on camera, in front of every single person in this room. She stepped forward, one slow step, and Vivian stepped back without meaning to. "Did I miss anything?" Della asked. "I would hate to leave anything out. I heard most of it from the drive. The windows were open. It carries beautifully out over the water." Vivian's lips moved. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding. There has not been," Della said. The blood was draining from Vivian's face now. From her cheeks down to her collar, her hand groped behind her for the back of a chair, found it, and gripped it white-knuckled, because she understood. Finally, what she had done, she had screamed at, searched, threatened, soaked, and struck across the face the only daughter of the one human being on earth who held her 100-year-old empire in the palm of her hand. The contract, the company, the name carved into the granite over the door, 4 generations of Hartwells. All of it ran, at this exact moment, straight through a quiet woman in a wine-stained coat that anyone could buy. "You cannot," Vivian breathed, and her voice came out thin and high and breaking. "You would not pull the renewal. It would destroy us. Thousands of jobs. The ports. The whole. You cannot." "I can," Della said simply, "and you have spent the last hour showing me in front of witnesses, on 100 cameras. Exactly why I should. Vivian swayed. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the chair, lost it, and sank slowly down onto the cold marble floor she was so proud of. The same floor she had just commanded a black woman to clean with her knees on the way out. She sat there in midnight blue silk and 4 generations of sapphires, pale and shaking, while 250 of the most important people on the coast stared down at her, and 100 phones recorded every single second of it. Get up. Mother. Jamile hisset. Frozen. The empty wine glass still clutched in her hand. For God's sake, get up. But Vivienne could not get up. The most powerful person in the room had just walked in through her front door in a coat from a department store, and the empire that had taken 100 years to build was coming down in a single night. And there was nothing in all her money or all her bloodline that could stop it. For a moment, nobody moved, and then the scrambling began. Camille recovered first. She set down her glass and rushed toward Della with a bright, desperate, sloppy smile, the same one she used for donors and photographers. Ms. Bishop, this is all just a silly misunderstanding. The lighting in here is dreadful. I never would have. And Imani. Well, Imani has always been like a daughter to this family. We adore her. We simply stop. Della said. Not loud. Just final. Camille stopped. Vivienne struggled back to her feet, gripping the chair. And when she spoke, her voice had gone small and pleading in a way that no one in that room had ever heard from her in their lives. Ms. Bishop. Della. May I call you Della? We are reasonable women. Whatever was said tonight got out of hand. A few heated words at an emotional family event. Surely we can fix this privately, quietly, between the two of us. A few heated words, Della repeated, and for the first time, she let the iron show all the way through. Madam, you put your hand across my daughter's face. The wine stain on Della's own coat had gone dark, the color of old blood, and she did not so much as glance at it. My daughter spent 2 years with your son, she said. In all that time, she never once told you my name, never told you what I built, never let you see a single dollar of it. Do you know why? Vivienne said nothing, because she wanted to be loved for herself, not for my money, not for my name. So she drove a plain car, and she wore plain clothes, and she let all of you believe whatever you wanted to believe about her. Della's voice never rose. She gave you 2 years to show her 1 ounce of kindness. And tonight, when you were absolutely certain she was poor, and black, and alone, and that no one who mattered was watching, you showed her exactly who you are. She turned slowly, taking in the whole silent room, every lifted phone, every important face, and now everybody knows. She reached into her coat and took out her phone. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She simply dialed a number and lifted it to her ear. And somehow, that calm was more terrifying than any rage could ever have been. It's me, Della said into the phone. The Hartwell Maritime Renewal. The 1.8 billion. Freeze it tonight. Effective immediately. And have legal begin termination first thing in the morning. A pause. Yes. I am sure. I will explain when I am back. She hung up. Vivienne made a sound, like the air had been driven out of her body. You cannot. That is thousands of jobs. That is the whole. You should have thought about your thousands of jobs. Della said. Before you struck my daughter at her own wedding, The room had become a solid wall of glowing screens. Every phone was up now, openly recording. The guards no longer even pretending to stop anyone. The night had already escaped the walls of Ravenscourt. It was somewhere else now. Multiplying. Unstoppable. Racing out across the dark water and into 100,000 other rooms, Raymond Voss had quietly stepped away from his employer, putting distance between himself and the woman who had just sunk the company, already thinking about the board, about the morning, about whatever could possibly still be saved. Frank Doyle had let go of Julian and stepped back with his hands open at his sides. The look of a man who had just realized he had followed the wrong order in front of 200 witnesses, all of them with cameras, and Julian crossed the floor and pulled Imani into his arms. Wine-soaked dress and all. "I am so sorry," he whispered into her hair. "For all of it. For here. For every minute of the last 2 years. It was never you," she said. "You stood between me and your own mother tonight. In front of everyone. That is all I ever needed to know." Della watched the two of them, and for the first time that night, her hard face softened. She put a hand on Julian's shoulder. "You stood up to her," she said quietly, "when you believed it would cost you everything you had. Your name, your inheritance, your family. You did it anyway." She nodded. "Owns," as if confirming something to herself. "I will not forget that. You are my son now, too, whether your mother likes it or not." Vivienne watched the three of them. This little circle of warmth she would never, ever be allowed inside. And something in her broke. Not with rage, with understanding. She had been handed a daughter-in-law worth more than her entire fortune. And she had spent the night spitting on her. "Please," she said hoarsely. "Della. There has to be something. Something I can." But Della had already turned away. "We are leaving," she told Imani gently. "All of us. Together." And as the three of them walked toward the tall front doors, the cold sea air rushing in to meet them, Vivienne Hartwell stood alone in the middle of her glittering ballroom, surrounded by 250 guests, more alone than she had ever been in her life. And then, only be one. The guests began to leave, too. It started near the doors and moved inward. Like a tide going out, a senator's wife collected her wrap and slipped away without a word. The federal judge set down a full glass and followed her. The columnist who had come to write something flattering about 100 years of Hartwell tradition put away her notebook and left to write something else entirely. They did not look at Vivienne as they went. That was the cruelest part. And she felt it land. For 40 years they had arranged their faces toward her, hung on her every opinion, laughed at the right moments, competed for the seat nearest her own. Now they could not get out of her house fast enough. And not one of them could meet her eyes. Because every single one of them had just watched, on 100 screens that were already everywhere, exactly what she was. And worse, exactly what they had stood there and allowed. The orchestra never played another note. The candles burned down. The great stone ballroom emptied around the matriarch of the house until there was nothing left in it but white roses, cold marble, a puddle of red wine drying on the floor, and a portrait of a dead man looking down at the ruins of the thing he had built. The fall had only just begun. By sunrise, the whole country had seen it. The videos went up before the reception even ended. 250 guests, 100 phones, and not one of them on Vivienne Hartwell's side. By morning, the clips had been stitched together, captioned, scored with sad piano music, and shared millions upon millions of times. The story wrote its own headline. A billion-dollar matriarch threw wine on her son's black bride at his wedding, slapped her across the face in front of 250 people, and then discovered the bride's mother was the one industrialist keeping the Hartwell empire alive. People watched Vivienne sneer the words "you're kind," and "black stray," and "ghetto girl." They watched a grown woman get struck across the face at her own wedding. Over a necklace, the old woman had misplaced herself. They watched a quiet woman in a plain coat say 6 words. I heard most of it from the drive, and bring a 100-year-old fortune to its knees on its own marble floor. The internet did what the internet does. It found Vivienne's old interviews, the ones where she called the Hartwells a family of values and discipline and honesty. It found her speeches at charity galas, the ones about lifting people up. It set them side by side with the footage of red wine arcing through the air and a jeweled hand cracking across a young woman's face, and the contrast was merciless. And then it went looking for the woman in the coat, and what it found turned the whole story into something close to a parable. Because Della Bishop had not been born into anything either. She was the daughter of a woman who cleaned houses, and the granddaughter of a woman who picked cotton. And she had started Bishop Global 30 years earlier, out of a single leased truck and a phone in a kitchen, hauling freight that the bigger companies would not touch, to ports that the bigger companies looked down on. She had built it load by load, contract by contract, through every door that got shut in her face, into one of the largest privately held logistics and infrastructure firms in the entire country. Reporters dug up a decades-old photograph of a young Della in a borrowed blazer, being turned away from the door of a shipping conference she had paid good money to attend, because the man at the door had assumed she was lost. That same woman now decided which century-old empires lived and which ones died. People set that photograph beside the clip of Camille pointing her toward the service entrance, and the whole country understood, in a way no lecture ever could have taught them, exactly what Vivienne Hartwell had sneered at when she sneered at a grandmother who scrubbed floors. She had spat on the very thing her own fortune had never once required of her, a person who built something out of nothing, with her own 2 hands, and kept her dignity through every single door that closed. Hartwell Maritime Group opened on the stock market that morning and dropped like a stone. By noon, the share price was down nearly 40%. By the closing bell, the company had shed a staggering amount of its value. 2 of its largest clients quietly suspended new orders before lunch. A pension fund that had held Hartwell shares for 30 years announced that it was, in its words, reviewing the position. Partners who had spent 2 decades shaking Vivienne's hand at the yacht club suddenly could not be reached by anyone. Inside the company's glass tower downtown, the board of directors called an emergency meeting. They gathered around a long table while the gray harbor moved below them, cold and indifferent. At the head of the table sat Patricia Lund, the lead independent director, sharp, silver-haired, and finished. She had warned Vivienne for years that her temper and her certainty would one day cost them everything. Now they had. There is no version of this that we survive with her at the top, Lund said flatly. The footage is on every screen in the country. The renewal is gone. The lenders are circling the loan covenants as we speak. Every single hour she remains chair. This company bleeds faster. Vivienne sat at the far end of the table, gray and hollow, in yesterday's clothes. Patricia, I built this. Charles and I built this with our bare hands. You cannot simply, we can, Lund said, and the words seemed to echo, because Vivienne had said almost exactly that, the night before, to a young woman in an ivory dress, and the vote has already been counted. It was not close. The board removed Vivienne Hartwell as chair and chief executive of Hartwell Maritime Group and stripped her of her seat. That same afternoon, The woman who had spent her entire life terrified of losing her place lost all of it in a single day. Not to a stranger, not to bad luck, but to her own voice and her own hand, captured on 100 phones, and played back to the entire world on an endless loop. Raymond Voss was named interim chief executive. His very first act was to pick up the phone and call Bishop Global. He did not get the contract back, but he got a meeting, which was more than Vivienne would ever get again. And in that meeting, he was handed a list of conditions that would reshape the company from the inside out. And then the legal reckoning came. And because of one slap, it came far harder than anyone in that ballroom had imagined it could. Imani had not screamed. She had not thrown anything. She had not so much as raised her voice. But what had been done to her had names. Real names. The kind that live in a courtroom. And a lawyer laid them out plainly across a polished table. Assault and battery. For the slap. A second count. For the wine thrown in her face by Camille. Unlawful detention and false imprisonment. For the forced search of her belongings without her consent and without cause. In front of 250 witnesses, a guard had laid hands on her husband and held him against his will, and all of it was on film, from 40 different angles, time-stamped to the second, because the slap was a crime, and not merely a cruelty. This did not stay in the quiet world of civil settlements. The district attorney's office, watching the same footage as the rest of the country, opened a case of its own. Vivienne Hartwell, who had spent 63 years certain that the law was a thing that happened to other people, was charged with criminal assault and battery. She was photographed walking into a courthouse with a coat held up over her face, by the same kind of cameras she had once been so happy to smile for. Imani also filed a civil suit. She did not ask for vengeance. She asked, in writing, for the record to say exactly what had happened. She asked for it to be true on paper. Forever. The Hartwell family settled the civil case within weeks. The amount was sealed. The apology was not. It was entered into the public court record. Signed. Dated. Undeniable. Admitting, in plain language, that Imani Bishop Hartwell had been falsely accused, unlawfully searched, publicly defamed, and physically assaulted, and that she had done absolutely nothing wrong. For a family whose entire religion was image, that paper trail was its own kind of sentence. Frank Doyle faced exposure of his own for carrying out the search, and facing real consequences. He did the math fast, and chose the truth he should have chosen in the first place. He testified that he had warned Vivienne twice that he needed consent, that the search was improper, and that she had overruled him and told him she did not care. The footage backed up every word he said. He kept his license by finally telling the truth. That night had cost him too much to keep swallowing. Camille did not escape either. Throwing a full glass of wine into a person's face has a name as well, and Della Bishop's lawyers used it. Rather than fight a case the entire country had already watched on a loop, Camille settled with a formal written apology, read aloud, and filed for the record. The woman who had sneered about a bold little dress and pointed a black businesswoman toward the kitchen had to put her own name beneath the words, "I was wrong." The country watched all of it land, and it did not look away. The footage played on a loop on every channel. Panels argued about it for days, about what the woman in the coat had really been testing, about the 40 guests who watched and laughed, about the ones who recorded every second and never once stepped in. And the guests, it turned out, did not get to simply walk away clean. The footage had faces in it. And the internet has a long memory and a very sharp eye. People found the woman by the bar who had covered her laugh with her glass while a bride was being searched. and she turned out to be a vice president at a bank that did not enjoy the attention. People found the man who had filmed the whole thing with a little smile and posted none of it until it was safe, and asked him, pointedly, why his hands had been so busy holding a phone instead of doing anything at all. One guessed, and only one, a retired schoolteacher who had been seated near the back top, was found to have set down her glass early in the evening, walked out before the worst of it, and told the valet on her way to her car that she would not be a part of what was happening in there. People found her too. They made her a small kind of hero, and she seemed embarrassed by it. And she said the only true thing that anyone said about that entire night, that she had not done anything brave at all. She had simply refused to stand there and watch. That, it turned out, had been the whole test. And almost everyone in that gilded room had failed it. Strangers began recognizing Imani in the grocery store, and they would simply nod at her. The small, quiet nod people give to someone who has walked through fire and come out the other side. Still standing, still kind. Vivienne's clubs quietly revoked her memberships. The boards of 3 charities she had once chaired asked, in carefully worded letters, for her resignation. The invitation stopped coming. The name Hartwell, 4 generations carved over a granite door, became something else overnight. A punchline, a warning, a clip people sent to each other with the caption, "Wait for the part with the bride." She had spent her whole life trying to protect her legacy, and in a single night she had become it, just not in the way she had planned. And through all of it, Imani stayed quiet. She gave no interviews. She posted nothing. When reporters camped at the end of her road, she walked out with a tray and offered them coffee, and asked them gently to please give the family a little room. Her silence said more than any statement ever could. She had never wanted a spectacle. She had only wanted, for 2 years, to be treated like a human being. The world had simply caught up to what she had known all along. Della Bishop made exactly one public comment, and only one. A reporter shouted a question at her as she left a building downtown, asking whether the Hartwell renewal would ever come back. Della stopped. She looked into the cameras, calm as ever. The very same way she had looked at a ballroom full of people who had decided she was the help. "I do not put my name beside people who price a woman by the cut of her dress," she said, "and I will never sign a single page with a woman who would raise her hand to a girl she thought was powerless. That is not cruelty on my part. That is just good business." Then she got into her plain car and drove away. And the clip of those few sentences went around the entire world by dinner. Hartwell Maritime did not die. Companies rarely do. But it shrank. And it restructured. And it survived only after new leadership signed reforms it should have had in place 100 years ago. A real ethics office, with real teeth. A direct, protected channel for any worker to report what they saw. And framed and hung by the front doors of the head office, where every employee and every guest would have to pass it. A written policy, in plain language, that no person who enters this company's property, employee, or client, or guest, will ever again be searched, detained, or laid a hand upon. On the word of one individual, the cost of those reforms had a face, and her name was Vivienne. But the change did not stop at the company gate. And that mattered more than any single firing or any single lawsuit. Because Della Bishop did something with her $1 billion lesson that turned it from revenge into reform, Bishop Global began writing dignity standards into every major contract it signed across the shipping and logistics industry. A clause that people started calling, simply, the Bishop Standard. Partners who wanted Della's business now had to prove, in real audits, that they trained their people, protected their workers, and treated the person carrying the tray with exactly the same respect as the person signing the check. An entire industry, watching what had happened to the Hartwells, quietly began to clean its own house. One cruel night, in one stone ballroom, had become a line in 1,000 contracts. And that is the whole difference between making one woman pay and making sure it happens to fewer women the next time. 6 months later, almost nothing about Imani had changed. She still drove the same 5-year-old car. She still wore plain dresses. She still knew the name of every server in every restaurant she walked into, and still tipped them like they had saved her life, and still asked the cloakroom attendant about her mother. The money had been there behind her the whole time, her entire life, quietly held, never once flashed. She had simply never needed it to know who she was. Her grandmother had taught her that, in a department store, a long time ago, with her chin up and her dignity intact, while a stranger searched her purse, Imani still wore Odessa's worn silver band every single day. It was worth $20. It was the most expensive thing she owned. Julian had changed, though. He stood taller now. The fear he had carried around his mother his entire life was gone, burned clean away the moment he chose Imani in front of 250 people, and did not lose her for it. In its place, he had something he had never once had, inside that cold stone house, a family that actually felt like one. He went to work, not at Hartwell Maritime, and not as anyone's favor. He started near the bottom of an unrelated firm and learned the business the slow way, on merit. The way his wife had always wanted to be measured. He did not speak to his mother. People assumed there was drama in that, some ongoing war, but there was not. There was just a quiet, final clarity. He had stood on that marble floor and watched the woman who raised him throw wine on the woman he loved and strike her across the face, over nothing, in front of everyone, and refused to stop even when she was proven wrong, and refused to say she was sorry even when there was nothing left to lose by saying it. A man can forgive a great deal, but he had learned something standing there that he could not unlearn, that his mother's cruelty had never really been about Imani at all. Imani had only ever been the latest person small enough, in Vivienne's eyes, to be safely stepped on. It had been happening his whole life. To the staff, to the help, to anyone without a name. He had simply been raised inside it, the way a fish is raised inside water, and had never once seen it clearly until it came for the person he had married. He wrote his mother a short letter. Near the end of that first year, it said he hoped she would find some peace, that he wished her well, and that he would not be coming home. He meant all three things. He did not hear back, and after a while he stopped expecting to, and one day the not expecting simply stopped hurting, and that was its own quiet kind of freedom. Della watched her daughter and her new son build a quiet, good, ordinary life, and she was at peace. She came for dinner most Sundays, to the small place Imani and Julian rented while Julian learned his trade. A walk-up with good light and a kitchen barely big enough for the three of them. Della would arrive in the same plain coat, clean now, the wine long gone, and she would sit at the little table while her daughter cooked the things Odessa used to cook. And for a few hours, she was nobody's chairman at all. And on one of those evenings, with the windows fogged and something simmering on the stove, Julian finally asked her the question he had been carrying for months. Why she had waited out at the gate that night. Why she had not simply walked in at the very start and ended it before it ever began. Della was quiet for a moment, turning Imani's $20 ring over where it sat on the table between them, catching the warm kitchen light on the soft gray silver. because I needed to see it. She said finally, not for the contract. I had already decided about the contract. I was never going to tie my company to people I did not trust. And I had my doubts about that family long before that night. She looked at her daughter. I needed to see what your mother's people would do to my child when they were certain she was poor and black and alone, and that no one who mattered was watching, because that is the only time you ever truly find out who someone is. Not when they think you are powerful. When they think you are nobody. She set the ring down gently. My mother taught me that in a department store a long time ago, and her mother taught her. We have been learning it for 100 years. She smiled. Small and tired and proud. I just finally had the standing to make it a lesson that cost somebody something. Imani reached across the little table and took her mother's hand, and neither of them said anything else. And the soup got done, and that was the whole inheritance. Not the company, not the $1.8 billion. That, a grandmother's steadiness, handed down across a kitchen table. 3 generations deep. Della never gloated about that night. She never had to. She had walked into a room full of people who decided she was nothing, the very instant they saw her face, and she had simply let them be exactly who they already were, and let the cameras do the rest. That was the whole lesson. She never once had to raise her voice to teach it. And Vivienne lived quietly now, in a much smaller house, with a name that opened no doors at all. The clubs were gone. The boards were gone. The invitations were gone. The empire was gone. The criminal case ended in a sentence she served in fines and community service and a permanent, searchable record, which for a woman like her was the heaviest weight of all. Sometimes, late at night, she would start to type a message to Imani. An apology. A real one. The words finally lining up the way they never had when it actually counted. She never sent a single one. Some part of her understood that the only apology that had ever mattered was the one she had refused to give when it could have changed everything. When a young woman in an ivory dress stood calm and kind in the middle of her ballroom and asked for nothing in this world but to be left alone. She had been handed a daughter-in-law worth more than her entire fortune, and she had thrown her away because of the color of her skin and the plainness of her dress and the work her grandmother had once done with her hands. That was the part that would haunt her. Not the money, not the company, not the name, the kindness she had been offered over and over and over again, and had spat on every single time, while it stood right there in front of her in flat shoes, knowing every server's name, never once needing Vivienne to know her own. So here is the thing I keep coming back to, and I want to be honest with you about it. The story you just heard is made up. Imani, Della, Vivienne, the wedding at Ravenscourt. None of it is real, but the feeling at the center of it is as real as anything in this world. The humiliation of walking into a room and being judged before you have said a single word. The assumption that you must be the help. The assumption that you took something, that you do not belong, that you climbed in, that you are less. The particular shame of being searched, or doubted, or struck, in public, for the crime of existing somewhere a person decided you should not be. That part is not fiction. That happens every single day. To real people, in real rooms. And here is the hard truth of it. Most of the time, there is no quiet woman in a plain coat waiting just outside in a dark car. Most of the time, there is no $1.8 billion contract to freeze. No perfect reversal. No 100 phones catching all of it so that the whole country is forced to look. Most of the time, The person being treated the way Imani was treated simply has to swallow it, keep her chin up the way her grandmother taught her, and walk home. So the real test of that night was never Vivienne's. We already know who Vivienne is. The real test belonged to everyone else in that ballroom. The 250 guests who watched a woman get searched and soaked and slept at her own wedding. The ones who laughed behind their glasses, the ones who looked away, the ones who lifted their phones and recorded every second, and never once stepped between her and the woman, tearing her apart. Because that is the part of this whole story that we actually get to choose. In our own lives, in our own rooms. So let me ask you, and I want you to be honest, if you had been standing in that ballroom, before anyone knew who Imani was, before the car came up the drive, before the name Bishop meant a single thing, when she was just a quiet young woman in a wine-stained dress with a red mark rising on her cheek, and the most powerful person in the room calling her a stray, would you have crossed that floor? Would you have stood next to her? Or would you have stayed quiet and held your glass and watched? Tell me. Drop it in the comments. I read them, all of them, and if this story moved you, do me one small favor. Like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to The Silent Verdict. Because around here, the quiet ones always turn out to be holding the entire deck. And the lesson Imani lived is one worth carrying with you. Never price a soul by the cut of her dress. The richest person in any room is almost never the loudest one. Sometimes she is the woman in flat shoes who knows every server's name, who wears a $20 ring like a crown, and who never once needed you to know who she was. She just needed to see whether you would be kind when you believed she was nobody. And that, in the end, is the only verdict that ever really mattered.